Hi, I'm Adam Jeffries with Tug Fishing Gear, and today we're talking about Dragonomics 101, which is our general course in fishing drag, how to understand drag, the mechanics behind drag, and how to properly set your drag to be the most effective when you're out on the water. So let's get started. So, why does drag matter? So, a properly set drag can be the difference between landing and losing the fish of a lifetime, right? You can go out and fish every day, set your drag however you want. You're going to catch fish, right? The problem is when you hook into that fish of a lifetime, if you're not prepared, that's when you break your line. That's when that fish gets into structure, breaks you off, and you lose a fish of a lifetime. So this is all about being prepared for that chance. So, why it matters is because a properly set drag is going to keep fish out of structure. It releases tension on the spool, right, to prevent line failures. So as that fish goes on a run or pulls on that line, if it pulls more than your set point, the drag is going to let line out. Hopefully you have a good drag, it's going to let it out smoothly. It also reduces fight time for a fresher release. So if you have a properly set drag, you're going to apply as much pressure as you can to that fish to wear them down quickly, get them to you, and you can get a fresh release out of that. Instead of fishing a really light drag, which lets the fight go on, but then that fish is exhausted when you land them. What it also does, it limits reel damage due to heat generation. So if you have your reel drag set too high and you have a big fish that goes on a long run, you may not break your line initially, but what could happen is because you've set your drag too high, you generate too much heat inside the reel, and then the drag washers can actually expand, the drag can go up or the reel can lock up. If those drag washers start shedding because there's too much heat, can lock up and break your fish off. All kinds of bad things happen if you don't set your drag properly. And the thing is, every reel has a drag. So learn to use it and you might save yourself a fish of a lifetime. So one thing I want to talk about for anybody that's fishing coastal waters, you all know it, is that sharks are winning this battle. Every minute a fish spends fighting is another minute for predators to find it and eat it. So, shark depredation continues to increase in many fisheries, especially in the southeast U.S. and like I say, all over the U.S., in Australia and different places. So, long fights increase lost fish because it gives the predators longer time to find that fish. And if you're just slowing the fish down, you're slowing it down just enough so that fish can get a meal. Longer fights increase post-release mortality, so you may get the fish to the boat or to land, but if that fish is exhausted, even if you revive it so it can swim away, it may be eaten on its way back to its home. So let's talk about what we can do about these things. And the first thing is we have to understand drag. And what the relationship is between torque versus drag. So drag is expressed in pounds, but that force is generated by the torque required to rotate the reel spool and release the line. So let's look at that. So you've got a reel spool here, and we've got it full of line, and then we've got a spool here, and enough of the line has come off this reel so that the radius from the center of the spool to the edge of the line is only half. When we're spinning the spool, where the drag is applying pressure to prevent you from spinning that spool, and that's the torque. So what's the torque it takes to turn and release this spool? Well, the torque stays the same, but the torque is a function of, this is your lever arm. The lever arm is when you're trying to pull line off of the reel, then that is your lever arm. So if it takes 10 pounds of force to turn the spool at full spool. At half, then it's going to take 20 because your lever arm is half what it was over here at the full spool. So why is that? And that's because it's a function of the lever arm, right? So a lot of times you'll see fishermen, they'll have a really light drag, they'll hook a fish, it takes off running, they start losing line, and what's the first thing that they do? They start grabbing the drag and start adjusting the drag to put more pressure on it to try to stop the fish. Well, wherever they were set before, if that fish went on a long run, the drag's already going up because they've lost line. The reel spool, the diameter and the radius has gone down. So the effective drag on the fish is actually going up, and as they adjust the reel, you'll see a lot of times they'll just quickly pop off because the reel was going up in drag, they're adjusting it, making it tighter, and you lose that fish. So this is how, you know, drag works on the fishing reels, is that you've got to pay attention to how much line you have on the reel. If you're set at a very aggressive drag, maybe 60%, you start to lose a lot of line, you may have to back your drag setting off to make sure that you don't break that fish off. So let's talk a little bit about different reel designs. So every reel design that I'm aware of, you know, is impacted by the torque versus drag to all these. So you've got your lever drags, you've got your star drags or bait casting reels, and you've got spinning reels. So let's talk about probably one of the most common reels in the world, the spinning reel. They make spinning reels now with drags up to 66 pounds, commercially available spinning reels. The pros to spinning reels are, they're very simple to operate, very quick learning curve on spinning reels. The nice thing is they are convertible from right to left hand operation, and it's easy to set the drag. So this is your drag knob. It's real easy to adjust that, set it to where you want it, and you're ready to go. The cons for spinning reels, you know, it's not easy to make precise adjustments on the drag. People have a tendency to overshoot. They get handsy, start adjusting this drag knob when they don't know exactly where they are on the drag curve, and they pop the fish off. Also, there's so many units that are sold on spinning reels. There's a lot of low quality units that have poorly designed drags. I've got some of those, I've had some in the past, and what you see there is when a fish goes on a run, then the drag takes off and it surges. So you get a spike and it's jerky, it's not smooth, and what that means is wherever that peak is, that's the max that you can fish it, because if you go above that, then you're going to break your line. So very poor quality drag systems can be a problem. So if you're going to fish in saltwater or in freshwater for big game fish, you want to make sure you have a good quality reel. So looking at one of our spinning reels that we fish, we got a Penn Battle 2 8000. Max rated drag is 30 pounds. So what you'll notice is that, so we use our drag scale to hook up every one of our reels and then model what the drag is as we adjust it. This chart over here shows you that it says here, you know, the drag curve is non-linear. Well, we're looking at the drag, the effective drag versus the number of turns on the drag knob. So we hook the reel up to a scale, turn the knob, adjust it at different set points, and what you'll notice is once you get to about 40% or 12 pounds right here, then this curve starts getting steeper. So as you're making adjustments, you can turn it one time and you get to 3 pounds. You can turn it another turn, you get to 6, 6.5, turn another turn, and well, then you double up to 12. If you were to turn it another turn, you'd go from 12 to 24, so you're doubling it again. And then if you go from 4, you can't even go to 5. You go from 24 up to 47 in about a half a turn. And this thing is only rated at 30 pounds, but yet when I locked it down, I got 47 pounds of drag force on that at full spool. So if I only had half the spool, this thing could literally be putting out almost 90 pounds of drag. So you have to be very careful with your reels to make sure you understand how much drag you're putting out. And for those people that like to fish a locked up drag, you better know what your drag is capable of doing when you do that, because if you lock this down, you're at 47 pounds, I can guarantee you I could be fishing 80-pound braid, and if I were to lock it all the way down and make a very aggressive, quick jerk, then there's no doubt in my mind that I could break that at 24, which is a third, or no, it's 30% of the 80, right? Because I took all the shock absorption and stretch out of the system, because the drag is not able to do its job and release that line quick enough. So if we, the one other thing I want to touch on is something I call the window of opportunity, and it most applies to the spinning reels, because say I'm fishing 30 pounds and I want to fish, the max I want to fish is 60% of the rated strength of that line. So 30 and 60% of that is 18. So I want to be here on the 18 on the curve. So if I'm fishing 18, if I back that off one full turn, so I'm here, if I back it off one full turn, I'm going to be about here. So I'm, about 9.5 pounds. So my window of opportunity, I can set it at 9 pounds if I want. Hook a large fish if I need to put max pressure on it. I can go one revolution of the drag knob, one complete revolution. I'm going to go to 18, which is 60%. I can fight that fish at 60%. Or if I'm fishing structure and I want to start at a high drag, I can fish at 18 pounds. And then if I hook, maybe I hook a kingfish, I hook something that goes on a long run, maybe I need to back the drag off, I can turn that one full turn, I can back it all the way down to 9 pounds and fight that fish. That's what I call my window of opportunity on a spinning reel. But the only way you can do that is that you have to understand the curve on your fishing reel. Every reel's different. I've got several pin Battle 2s. The curve is slightly different on each one of them. So if you understand your curve, you've got a good grasp of what your window of opportunity is within one turn of the drag knob. So looking at bait casters, star drags, then, we got drags up to 40 pounds. Some of the pros are you get better cranking power with these reels, improved casting accuracy. There's, a lot of bass fishermen fish exclusively bait casters. They handle heavier line than, say, your spinning reels do, and you don't have any line twist to deal with, right? Some of the cons are, it's a steeper learning curve because, let's face it, you got backlashes, you've got to tune that reel depending on the size of the lure you're fishing, and you've got to get used to, thumbing the spool sometimes when you're casting, different things. It's just a little steeper learning curve. Great reels, and each one has its place. The other thing is that the drag in these reels typically acts on the gear train and not directly on the spool, and that's one reason why you don't see them as high a drag rating as your lever drags, and also they don't dissipate the heat as well either. So if we look at the Penn Squall 2 25 star drag, we look at the drag curve here. It's not linear. If you remember the spinning reel we had, we went from 0 to 5 turns. In this one's even steeper. It only goes to about 2.5 turns before it reaches the peak value. So once you get to 5 pounds or 20% of the max, it starts getting steeper. And then those micro adjustments make a bigger difference when the drag curve gets steeper. So you can make a quarter turn or a half a turn. So in this case, if you're here and you do a half a turn, you go from 5 to 10, you're doubling your effective drag by just doing a half a turn, or yeah, half a turn on the drag knob. But you will notice this reel, the locked up drag, so the rating is 25 pounds, locked up drag is 27 pounds. So it's much closer to the rating on the box. But that's why it's important to test all your equipment, make sure when they are locked up and what is their performance across the different scenarios. Now, talking about conventional reels or lever drag options. So with the lever drag option, then you've got drags up to 150 pounds out of standard commercial units that are sold. I'm sure there's other units that are custom units that go well above that. But the way these work is you've got your drag adjustment knob, you take your lever and you take it out of gear all the way down, you adjust your knob, and then you engage your lever. And that lever, you can start it at a very low setting, and you could have that maybe where you hook the fish, and then you can adjust that on the fly and go all the way to your strike position or to your full position, and you've got a very wide range of drags that you can manage, and it's very repeatable. So the pros to this are, extremely high drag capabilities, very repeatable on the drag settings. The nice thing is you can set this unit, take it out of gear, and you don't have to adjust the drag or release the drag overnight. If you look at your star drags and your excuse me, the spinning reels, whenever you're done fishing, you should always back the drag off, back the tension off the drags, because if you don't, those washers can actually stick together. The next time you go out, if you were fishing a high drag, if you're fishing 50, 60%, it might be 80 and 90% because those drag washers stuck together. So you want to make sure you're always backing those drags off at the end of the day. So the other thing is, in lever drags, the drag pressure acts directly on the spool. So these units are really good at heat dissipation. They've got smooth drag curves over heavy loads. Just a great overall reel for heavy fishing, heavy game fish you're dealing with. The cons are, they're not really good at casting overall. There are some units that are, they are bulkier and heavier. They're more expensive because they're more complex. But for, heavy fishing in, deep fishing with large species, you've got, some of these have 2-speed. This particular one has 2 speeds where you can put it in high gear or low gear to really crank and get those fish off the bottom. You don't retrieve as much line as quickly, but you've got a lot more power, torque. And then for any really large game fish, this is going to be the way to go because you've got that lever that you can really modulate that drag throughout the fight to be heavy or light depending on what stage of the fight you're in. So something that all of these designs are susceptible to, it's called reel stick slip. So not all drags are created equal. So stick slip occurs when a drag system requires significantly more force to start moving than to keep moving. So what happens is you've got the drag sticks, and then as pressure builds up, suddenly it releases, and then the pressure drops, and it starts to stick again, and the pressure builds up, and it releases, it starts to stick again, and you have this cycle. And I'm sure if you've ever had lower quality reels, or years ago, all the reels did this, is that they didn't have good drag systems. So literally, you'd feel it like this. It would spike up, and then there'd be no, and you pull forward, and then it would release the pressure, and then you pull back, and then it would go forward. You get those surges, and those surges are spikes in pressure, and those spikes in pressure can create shock loads. They can break leaders and knots, pull hooks. all kinds of bad things happen. So in this scenario, a reel could be set, the drag could be set at 10 pounds, but if you have stick slip involved or stiction, then it might take 15 pounds to get it started in a cheap reel. So you're effectively, your peak is the 15, so that's your limitation. You can't fish more than 10 pounds if your 15 point is where you're going to break off at. So effectively, if you had a better quality reel, that's why quality drag systems matter, because they minimize this difference. Ideally, you want to have 0 delta between where your drag setting is and where that reel starts to release line. So the better quality drags, the smoother it is, and that's what you're seeing. Those smooth drags have very little difference between the set point and when they're actually running. So the other thing, the key takeaway here is, fish break tackle from peak loads, not from steady drag pressure. For the most part, it has to do with a peak load. They go on a surge and then there's no give in the line because of the drag is locked down, or you get surges and the drag starts to stick. It spikes up real quick, and it's so fast you can't even tell it almost, is that it spikes real quick and you break that fish off. So very important to understand stick slip. And the other thing, that stick slip is much more in play when you're operating in the top half or top 50% of your drag setting. So if you've got a reel that is capable of 40 pounds of drag, you're not going to see as much stick slip down in that 20 pounds of drag or less. But as you get up above 50% and you put more pressure on those drag washers, that's when you start to see more of the stiction and the stick slip happen. So that's where you've got to be careful when you're operating towards the top end of your drag settings on your reels. So with all this being said, where should we set drag? Well, the first thing we have to understand is, what's our weakest link? We obviously can't set our drag above our weakest link. And so in order to do that, we got to determine our actual knot strength, the strength of our tackle. Here, we've got 20-pound braid tied to 30-pound fluorocarbon using an inline swivel and then tied to a hook, right? So we've got a number of places where this could break. It could break in the braided line. It could break at the knot of the braid to the swivel. It could break at the knot leaving the swivel to the leader, or the knot to the hook. Each one of these is a different place, right, that it could break. With this setup, whatever setup you're using, you should always tie these setups, use a scale, break these setups and figure out where it breaks. Most people will tell you that that braid is much stronger than this 30-pound fluorocarbon. However, if you tie that braid to this with a knot to this swivel, I'm going to tell you that this is the weakest point in this connection. Most likely, this is going to be somewhere in the 16-pound range, maybe even 15 pounds breaking strength on that. So that's going to be our limiting factor in this, and we have to account for that. So then I'm going to take 70% of whatever my breaking strength is, and that's where I'm going to set the maximum of my drag. So just for round numbers, if my setup were to break at 10 pounds, then 70% of that is 7. I'm not going to set my drag over 7 pounds. I want to have that 30% differential, right? So that's how we go about determining what the maximum we're going to set our drag is. Then we got to determine what species we're targeting, and adjusting for structure and depredation risk is, if there are no predators in the area and there's no structure in the area, I can fish a light drag and that's perfectly fine. I can wear that fish down, revive the fish, can go back to go back safely, or I can put the fish in the box. Either one, right? If there's structure, if there's predators in the area, got to fish a higher drag to make sure I land that fish quicker. So, some of the common myths about drag are, for years people say, fish one third of the strength. Where should I set my drag? That's the most popular answer. Well, it's about a third. 25% to 30%, somewhere like that. And the truth is, the best drag varies by species and the risk of loss to structure or depredation. Not only that, is that when the 1/3 of the line strength was first used and over all these years, our lines are much better now. Our knots are much better now. Our drag systems are much better now. Don't have as much stick slip or surge as they used to have. So we're able to effectively fish much higher drags than people were in the past. So as technology's improved, make sure you're understanding that so you can apply that to your fishing and take advantage of it. So the other myth is lockdown drag applies the most pressure. You see this all the time as people say, oh, I'm fishing a lockdown drag, I got to get them out of that structure. Well, that's all well and good, but I'm here to tell you that if you lock that drag down on that Battle 8000 at 47 pounds, you could be fishing 80-pound braided leader. And I'm here to tell you, if you lock it up, you get a big fish on and you make an aggressive strike on that fish, there's a good chance that you could actually break that at 30% of it, so 24 pounds, which is well below the rating on that line. A lot of people would say there's no way you can break braid that way. I've done it. I've done it in the field. I've done it in the lab. You absolutely can. If there's no give in the system, you will break prematurely. The thing is, if you set your drag at 60% of the rated strength of the line, you're going to put more effective pressure on that fish than somebody fishing a locked up drag. One of the things that people do with locked up drag is they end up fishing line weights that are much heavier because of that. They may fish a locked up drag and they may be fishing 100-pound, 120-pound test line when we're fishing 60 or 80-pound test line and we're fishing 60 pounds of 60% of the drag. We're putting just as much pressure on them and we're spending less on our line. We're able to cast further if we're fishing spinning lines and stuff because our line is much smaller. A lot of really good advantages to setting your drag properly. Also, a light drag is best to let the fish wear down. That might be true if you don't have predators, you don't have structure in the area. The thing is, heavier drag reduces the fight time and results in fewer lost fish to structure, depredation, and also allows you to have a fresher fish for release. So what we have discovered in the field and throughout our testing is that we tested over 100 anglers, and on a 20-pound leader setup, the average in traditional drag, they said we'll set it about 30%. So 30% is 6 pounds on a 20-pound leader. So when we tested those, the average was 2 pounds. So they were intending to set it at 30% of their leader rated strength. They were actually setting it to 2 pounds because they didn't measure it. What they did is they took it, they adjusted it, they pulled it, they said, oh, that's about 6 pounds, that's where I'll fish it, where it was really 2 pounds. So because of that, they were only fishing 10% of their leader rated strength. In our studies and what we have determined is our alternatives are we're fishing at least 40%, which would be 8 pounds, and we'll go upwards of 60%, which would be 12 pounds. And we're measuring that with a scale. So the difference is if I'm fishing 4 or 8 pounds on this 20-pound leader, or 12 pounds, not breaking knots, not breaking lines, we've done it in the field over many fishing trips and proved it that, at 8 pounds, we're fishing 4 times what the average angler was fishing. We're fishing at 12 pounds, we're fishing 6 times. So you can only imagine how much shorter that fight time is when we're applying this much pressure to those fish as opposed to what the traditional anglers were doing. So what's happening here, a lot of times these fishermen they're setting it at 2 pounds, they don't know it. They hook the fish starts to run, they start adjusting the drag or palm the spool to apply more pressure. While they're doing that, just that little bit of delay gives those predators that opportunity to eat that fish. So it all has to do with setting your drag properly, using the scale, set it right the first time. When you hook that fish, you're turning that fish's head and you're moving it to the boat. So from our studies and from our analysis, we're challenging traditional wisdom because the 1/3 rule, is it really enough? In our estimation, it's not. And the reason is our field testing has showed that structure-oriented species could be successfully fought at drag settings approaching 60% of the leader strength with no leader failures, no knot failures, significantly shorter fights, and we have literally reduced our depredation by up to 80%. The first time we did this in the field, I thought it was a fluke. We repeated it, we got the same results. We repeated it, we continued to fish and fish, and we still got the same results. So I'm sold on the fact that we're able to fish much higher drags than we ever fished in the past. We're able to land those fish quicker and reduce the amount of interactions we have with predators. One thing we should talk about on strategy is that not all fish are the same. Strategy depends on the species. So if we have structure-oriented fish like snapper, grouper, snook in the mangroves, bass, is that we can have an aggressive drag strategy somewhere starting at 40 to 60% of the rated strength of the line. This prevents the fish from reaching structure. It gets their heads turned, coming to us quickly. When we move into other types like pelagics, tunas, wahoos, mahi, is that we need to probably start at moderate drags in the 25 to 30% and then increase as that fight goes on. If we hook that tuna at 25 to 30%, they go on a long run, half our line goes out, so half the spool radius of the line, then our effective drag went from 30 to either 50 or 60. We're still within that 60 mark. We know we can handle that drag, right? But if we started high, there's a good chance they could go on a run and break us off. So we want to start low. As the fight progresses, we can crank down the drag. With our spinning reel, we know where that is on the curve. We can adjust it half a turn or a turn to take us back to where our 60% number is and apply the maximum amount of pressure to that fish so we can land that fish quicker. So on other sport fish, tarpon, sailfish, marlin, but like tarpon, a lot of people will fish a very light drag. They'll start low, and instead of even setting the drag, they'll palm the spool. I'm personally not a real fan of palming the spool. I'm just not as good at that. So what I like to do is I like to start low, but and fishing with a spinning reel, I like to use my window of opportunity, set it down there at that 30% number, knowing that when I turn it a half a turn or a full turn, where that's going to put me in the drag curve so that later in the fight, I can adjust that drag up, the pressure up, to pull that fish to the boat once it starts to tire out. On marlin, you're predominantly fishing lever drags, and you've got the full gamut of where your drag is from start all the way to sunset. You can manage that during the fight. Have a light setting at hook set, and then as that fish tires out, you can adjust the drag up. If they decide to go on surge on another long run, you can back it down. You can manage your drag dynamic a lot better with the lever drag reels. So conservation benefits is, faster fights help release fish. So there's reduced exhaustion. You're able to get those fish. Yes, they are green when they get the boat, but that's actually a good thing because when you release them, they're going to have a good chance of getting back to cover and away from predators. So you're going to have lower post-release mortality, less shark interaction. Got a picture here of a snook. We were told, you know, I talk to a lot of people who say, I can't even fish in the backcountry in Everglades anymore. There's too many sharks. All you're doing is feeding the sharks, your snook, when you're catching them. What we found is that when we went back and we were fishing either 20-pound leaders or 30-pound leader, depending on the size of snook involved, when we were fishing 60% of that rated line, we were able to put enough drag force on that fish that we could land that fish in under a minute, right, from where we were. And literally there was one place where we had 3 6 to 8 foot bull and lemon sharks. We're catching snook and we're pulling them right past the sharks. Yeah, one time we had to set we caught the fish on one side of the boat and ended up having to take it and move it to the other side real quick. But they were fresh. When they went and hit the water, they took right off. Okay? So we did not have nearly the kind of problems that other people had that were fishing light drags, that those fish were struggling. Anytime that fish pulls drag and it's struggling, those predators can get on it real quick and eat it. Some people will say, well, you can't fish snook with a heavy drag, you'll pull the hooks. Well, that might be true. You might lose some from pulled hooks, but I would rather lose some to a pulled hook than just having the head of a snook, and that's all I get. So, you know, it's all about conservation here, is that we want to have fun fishing, but we also don't want to be feeding the sharks or feeding the Goliath groupers, the other predators. So the key takeaways from Dragonomics 101 is, you know, drag changes as the spool diameter, the spool radius changes. So as you're losing line, even if you don't adjust the drag is going up because your lever arm, which is the radius of that spool, is getting smaller because you're losing line. You need to understand that. So if you initially set your drag at 60% or really high, if fish is going on a long run, you better back that down, back the drag off, because your drag is increasing as your line's going out. Vice versa is true, is that, you know, if you're fishing at light and that fish you're structure oriented and they're not going on long runs, all you're doing is letting that fish run when you could be fishing a heavier drag. The other thing is small adjustments can create large drag changes. In those drag curves, understanding your equipment, your reels, is very important, so that when you're fishing, it's real easy on spinning reels to adjust that drag knob. You've got to understand, if I'm at 10 pounds and I turn that a quarter, now where am I? If I turn it a half, where am I? Because those curves get so steep, you know, a quarter turn could effectively double the drag and you break it off. That's the most common thing I see on spinning reels, is people adjust that, and as they adjust it, they have no idea where they are. They make a half a turn or a quarter turn and they pop the fish off. So the other thing, key takeaways, fight time affects both catch rates and fish survival. The faster we can land those fish, the more likely we're going to land whole fish, and the more likely we're going to release a fish that's going to survive. Another key takeaway is most anglers intend to fish less drag than they should. So they intend to fish 30%, 33% because that's what they've been told over the years, that's where you should fish your drag. Nowadays, with better lines, better reels, better technology, and measuring your drag, you can effectively fish much higher drags, upwards of 50 to 60% in certain situations. And the average angler is only fishing 33% of their intended drag because they're setting their drag manually. Instead of using a scale to actually determine what their drag is set at, they're setting it manually and they're guessing wrong most of the time. Like I said, we've tested hundreds of anglers. It's about a third of where they intend to set it, which in turn, if you're starting at a third and you do a third, then you're basically at about 10% of what the rated strength of the line is what they're actually fishing. So the key takeaway in this whole presentation should be, measure your drag. It removes all the guesswork out of it. You know, test your tackle, put all your tackle together, hook a scale up, break it, see where it breaks, and then set your drag based off of that and based off the fish that you're fishing. Is that fish going to go on a long run? Is that fish structure oriented? It's not going to go on a long run. It's just going to make a powerful surge and try to get to structure. So that's where we say the last thing is understand your tackle limits and the species. You know, those requirements can allow you to fish 4 to 6 times the drag of average anglers. So if this angler is fishing, you know, they said they're starting at 30% and then they're fishing a third of that, you know, they're only fishing 10% of the rated strength of their line. We have proven on structure-oriented fish, we can fish 60%, right? So we would be fishing 6 times, right out of the gate, be fishing 6 times as much pressure as that average angler would be. So this information, I hope it's beneficial to you, and we appreciate you spending time with us today. If you want to learn more, follow us on Instagram at Tug Fishing Gear or at tugfishinggear.com. Tight lines.